Like vacation, sex, and the arts, heroin is one of the tools that I use to maintain my work-life balance.
In his provocative new book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Dr. Carl Hart makes the case that the dangers of drugs have been greatly exaggerated and says the war on drugs is not a war on drugs, it's a war on us. The book has been a lightning rod of controversy on social media, people calling it reckless and dangerous, and headlines like this one from the Wall Street Journal saying it doesn't offer a detailed blueprint for keeping drugs away from the people whose lives can be ruined. But Dr. Hart, a Columbia professor, makes the argument with nearly 3 decades of experience as one of the world's leading researchers on the effects of drug use. Growing up in Miami during the crack epidemic, Dr. Hart was convinced it was drugs that were destroying his neighborhood, only later concluding that the laws policing them were the real problem. Now, the husband and father of 3 is shattering deep-rooted views by going public with his own use of drugs like heroin, which he says make him a better person.
There aren't many things in life that I enjoy more than a few lines by the fireplace at the end of the day.
Dr. Carl Hart joins me now from his home in New York City. Thank you so much for joining. I can't tell you after your book was released how many people called and said, you've got to have him on the show. You've got to have him on the show. And this being a daytime show, Dr. Hart, you can imagine that came with a lot of conversation. What are we going to talk about here? And are we sending a wrong message to people? But I wanted to talk to you in your own words, in your own thoughts here. So this is a zone of no judgment, I should say. But we are here to understand this. You did an interview with Joe Rogan on his podcast, and you told him that you do heroin the night before a big interview because, as you put it, I'm at my best when you are relaxed, and this helps you. Did you use before, and I think this is a big interview, did you prepare in the way that you referenced in that interview with Joe Rogan?
No, we're in a pandemic. My conversation with Joe's a friend. And so we were having a conversation like we would have in our living room. And so it's really important for people to understand why I even acknowledge that I use heroin. I did it so that America could see that the majority of people who do drugs like heroin included. By the way, I talked about using a number of other drugs, but the only one that they focus on is heroin. But that's cool.
Why do you think that was the case? I'm sorry to interrupt, but why do you think the focus was on the heroin part? Because you did refer to yourself as an unapologetic drug user. Why do you believe it was the heroin that caught all of the headlines and the heat?
Well, we have to understand, first of all, the headlines, the negative headlines came out after the New York Post did their piece. And the New York Post has never been a friend of Black people. So they wrote these salacious headlines, took the book out of context, never read the book. And so the people who were saying negative things, they never read the book. They don't understand that the reason why I acknowledged heroin use or any other drug use was so America could see that the vast majority of the people who use drugs are middle class or upper class people who are like me, except most of them are white. But we think that the majority of drug users are poor, Black, brown people. And that's just simply not the case. But that's where the war on drug targets. It targets those people who are poor, targets people who are Black and brown. And so I was trying to ask the middle class, privileged white folks, get out of the closet about your drug use. Like me, if I was going to ask them to do something, I had to do it myself. Get out of the closet. In that way, we can have a more representative view of what a drug user look like. And that way, we can take some of the pressure off of the poor people who are catching hell for the very thing that all of these wealthy people are doing. Let's just be clear. The drug trade, the illicit drug trade, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. This industry could not be supported without middle class, upper class, privileged people. Let's be clear.
But do you consider yourself upper class and privileged? Obviously, you're African American, so we certainly, as I am, know the struggles. But with that said, the socioeconomics that you are speaking may have applied to you growing up in Miami. They don't apply to you now, although the dangers of being a Black man certainly do.
Of course, I came out of the closet because I know there's a risk. But if we think about all of our heroes, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, all of those people put their bodies on the line so that we could be free. The same is true here when we think about drugs. I'm trying to educate the public. I'm trying to show them where the real dangers are at. So when we think about a drug like heroin or any drug, particularly heroin, let's just talk about the opioids. The dangers lie in the fact that people don't know what they're taking. And in my book, I tell people how we can change that by having these things called drug checking centers, like they have in Switzerland, like they have in Spain, like they have in Portugal. They're not that expensive, and we could save lives. And I was
So
trying
is
to
that
tell
the
people.
ultimate goal here? You believe this path that you are discussing openly, the goal is to save lives?
Absolutely, the goal is to save lives. When I think about my heroes, for example, I think about people like Prince, who died 5 years ago. From what I understand, Prince had what he thought was Percocet, which contains oxycodone, actually contained fentanyl because he didn't know what was in his substance. If we would have had drug checking facilities, he would have known what was in his pill. And that way he would have known not to take it or to take a much lower dose. There are so many Americans who are dying every year from this type of ignorance. And in my book, I'm advocating that we have these drug checking facilities so people can be informed. That's just one of the things that I'm advocating for.
Dr. Hart, you talked about in your book in 2000 about I think he was then 16-year-old son, Tobias, who you did not know about until later in life. And you write about him in your book, High Price, saying that he'd taken the path you'd feared most, that he spent time in jail for drugs. How much of this has influenced your ability to come out on the forefront, that it is in some ways personal for you because of your son and also what you saw growing up in Miami?
Well, it's not personal because of my son. It's personal because I'm a Black man in America, and I see that we have 2.3 million Americans locked behind bars, and 40% of those people are Black men, and Black men only make up 6% of the general population. And the war on drugs is a primary reason it's a primary tool. We can think about George Floyd at this moment, Derek Chauvin, the guy who we all saw choke and kill this guy in front of our eyes. But yet he's on trial and he's trying to blame drugs for the death of George Floyd. We know in the past, this defense have worked. This sort of drug-crazed Negro defense has worked. It worked in the case of Philando Castile in Minnesota, where the police officer Geronimo Yanez got off. It worked in the case of Terrence Crutcher, a guy in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who was shot by the police.
So you're intersecting what you are doing in what you're revealing about yourself is not so much of how it makes you feel. It is, from what I'm hearing, the intersection of obviously the drug war, which failed, and how it's still used to disproportionately prosecute and dehumanize certain segments of our society. But I do want to talk to you.
Wait, 1 second. The drug war did not fail. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this. A lot of people are still getting paid from the drug war. That's why we continue it. Police officers, politicians, hotels, restaurants near prisons, they are getting paid. That's why we continue this drug war at the expense of poor people, of Black people. So when we say it's failed, I try to point out in my book that it hasn't failed. It's working precisely like it was designed to work in 1914. This is not anything. This is not an aberration. This is by design.
Let me look at these numbers here. In 2019, there were nearly 50,000 opioid-involved overdose deaths in the United States alone. How do we then peel that number off from the clearly larger and important conversation about private prisons and the money-making of incarceration and all of the things that you just named for the people, though, who, as you know, will say, I have a loved one who died of an overdose. I have someone in my life who would not benefit from simply stopping and testing out the drug before they used it. Because by the numbers,
that I have in front of me, somewhere around 23 to 38% of first-time heroin users become dependent. And that was a study that you yourself have cited. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, but what that tells you is that the vast majority of people who do heroin won't become addicted. And so if we know that, 75% of the people who do heroin won't become addicted, then we can't blame heroin for the addiction. We have to look beyond the drug itself. That's what those numbers tell us. And then when we think about opioid-related deaths, the most important thing that I point out in the book is that when people die from a drug like an opioid, they have multiple drugs in their system, and we don't know which drug was the causal agent. And I'm asking people, the CDC and coroners and medical examiners, to do a better job at dissecting what's really going on. And when we see what's really going on, people are dying because their drugs are tainted with contaminants. And we can control this by having drug checking facilities.
I think that your passion in what you're articulating right now is the result of really being beaten up in the press with people taking things out of context and losing sight, as controversial as it may seem, of what your intention is. And you say it is to save lives, and there are so many lives that need to be saved because of what we're seeing around the world. So thank you, Dr. Hart, for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.